Hi, I'm Robbie. This is Marginal Reads, where I'm reviewing short fiction, generally focusing on science fiction, horror, maybe some crime. But I'm particularly interested in fiction that tries to escape the restrictions of its genre, the stuff that maybe has more literary pretensions, or the literary stuff that's trying to be more genre-like, that sort of crossover particularly interests me. So far, I've reviewed a few short story anthologies, but I thought it would be nice to review a novella. So I read Termush by Sven Holm. Oh, look at this cover here. It's a Faber and Faber new printing that came out in 2023, but it was published in the late 60s, I think. When was that? 69? 67. It was translated into English in 69. Termush is incredible. This book is amazing. I loved it. There's so much to talk about with this. It's about a luxury hotel weathering the nuclear apocalypse. But really, it's about the psychology of living through crisis and how fascist tendencies can grow within democratic systems in times of crisis. But also just about how boring crisis is and how dull and bleak. And when you're in a crisis, you can't stop thinking about it. You're forced to think about the situation all the time, the wider situation, but you rarely have all the details. It's a struggle to get information because a crisis is inherently complex and you're never going to be able to get all the information. But it's particularly not helped when the authorities don't want you to have all the information, Yeah, it's about that. It's great. Do you ever feel like the world is burning, but you look out the window and everything appears fine, and like the incongruency between those two things just makes everything weird and eerie, There's a real focus on that, particularly at the beginning of the book, where the nameless narrator he's writing down everything that's happening in a diary. So it's like an epistolary format. None of us had expected that it would happen so painlessly. I mean that both literally and metaphorically. We had unconsciously thought in terms of something more drastic, a radical transformation, with every single object showing traces of what occurred, the furniture and the walls changing character, and the view outside our window revealing a totally different world. Nevertheless, we feel the changes somewhere in ourselves. The state of panic and anticipation is over and has been replaced by complete deafness, not just of the ears, but of the whole body, a sense of exhaustion or deep-seated dizziness. We cannot get up from a chair or go to the door without being aware of this, yet no one among us can control it. Everything has changed, yet we search for one single detail which has in fact been altered. It is like a wavering convalescence between sickness and death. Amazing, right? The writing is so good in this. It's like this all the way through. It's like 120 pages, but it's quite sparse. It's probably a bit shorter than that sounds. And there's lots of little chapters. I think if this was written now, it might be called like a flash novella. Lots of little flash pieces stringing together a longer story. I read a book recently, Urst, by Deborah Tompkins, who referred to that book as a flash novella, which felt quite similar to this in some ways in that format. That's a good book as well, by the way. It's quite Le Guinian in its setup. It's a guy from like a parallel Earth where climate change hasn't happened, but the Earth is going back into an ice age because of it. And they're maybe not anarchist, but there's not much hierarchy in their society. It's like reduced hierarchy. And what hierarchy there is matriarchal, and there's lots of reciprocity of care going on. And it's really interesting, particularly the stuff on that alternate Earth. And then he travels to an Earth which is like ours, but worse, and has a bad time. But back to Termush. So lots of people are talking about this book in terms of being very relevant, particularly because of the pandemic. And I completely agree. There was a lot of parallels between how it felt to read this and how it felt to go through lockdown while, the epidemic is still raging around. I think this relevance could be applied to lots of situations. And actually, I felt like it was perfectly relevant to right now, this minute, particularly as the book goes on and the crisis keeps building and the behavior of the guests and management gets worse and worse. The guests have bought their stay in the hotel in anticipation of nuclear war. They're not just there by chance. They're fully equipped, they've got loads of supplies. The management are cleaning everything outside, washing everything down all the time, every time it rains, to try and get rid of any residual radiation. Anytime it rains, it sets off the radiation alarm and they have to go into the shelter and hunker down there for a few days or several hours at least. And outside of the hotel, there are sick and injured people who were in the direct nuclear fallout. Hardly any direct attention is given to them in the narrative, which is fully intentional. Even though the main character is sympathetic to them, he's still unable to do anything about it. He's just watching helplessly while the guests and management together get more and more riled up against the idea of being overrun by the sick and injured, or the survivors from outside. It felt very relevant to experiencing a crisis and some kind of governing body trying to deal with that crisis in a way which is the appearance of safety matters more than safety itself. You know, there's a point where he's talking about, well, actually, the threshold at which the radiation alarm is set is arbitrary and it's high. And they're only detecting like large fallouts, but there's nothing stopping the gradual accumulation of radiation in their bodies. And yet they're pretending that they're safe because they go down to the shelter when the radiation goes high and they come up when it's not. But actually, they're not safe. They're still being contaminated by the radiation. They're still going to get sick eventually. And that really reminded me of like some of the ridiculous policies being put forward by, the UK government, but a lot of Western governments in the face of the pandemic, vacillating between lockdown and not lockdown. We can't sacrifice the economy, no matter what, you know. There were some particularly egregious things like funneling lots of old age pensioners from the hospitals into care homes with the full knowledge that it would create a huge epidemic in those care homes and just like killed thousands of people. And yeah, like in the UK during the pandemic, I say during the pandemic, it's still going on. COVID's still raging all over the place. People are still getting long COVID. People have just chosen to forget about it, you know. And the people who have been left disabled by it. There's no additional care available for all of the people who have long COVID now. I know 2 people with long COVID. It's completely debilitating. But if you look everywhere else, it's as if it never happened, you know. Almost immediately after one of the lockdowns in the UK, Rishi Sunak introduced a policy called Eat Out to Help Out, where they were giving people vouchers or something to go eat out at restaurants. Absolutely mad. A huge increase in cases followed. But they just arbitrarily, after a certain amount of lockdown, had said that the economy was presumably tanking. And they were like, oh, you're safe now. You know, it's gone down enough. You're safe. And then got everyone to go into restaurants to stimulate the economy, which also stimulated the epidemic. I was going back to work in the lab and we were being given masks by the hospital I work in, which were like just those incredibly cheap surgical masks that like do nothing except maybe kind of stop you from touching your face, which is doing something, to be fair. But at the time I was on one of the vulnerable lists because of a medication I was on, but then I got taken off. So they decided later that it was fine, which was quite funny, really. But I'd been isolating for a longer time than a lot of people. And when I came back into work, I was feeling particularly paranoid. Although paranoid suggests that the danger isn't there. It was there. I'd bought myself some better masks. And so had a couple of other people in the building. And then we got an email being like, everyone needs to wear the official masks that have been given out. It's like the official masks are less safe than these ones we've bought for ourselves. You can say something and be like, it sounds like it's safe, you know, like, oh, wear the official masks we're giving out, but it's not. And they were obsessing about setting up one-way systems so no one passed each other in the corridors. And then we were just sitting next to each other in the lab and in the office. And it's like, so much effort gets put into the illusion of safety, That same principle applies to so many things, caring more about the measure of the thing rather than the thing itself, like caring about grades more than education, or the results of diagnostic tests instead of symptoms or pain, or the word of an official body over the clear reality reported from the ground. Or I think often it's seen as being tied up with bureaucracy, but it's wider than that. When you dig into a lot of things, they are often more a simulation of what you think they should be rather than the thing itself. Like the government in the UK, most of what it's seen to be doing is just pretending to do stuff that has effect when they know it will have no effect. And, you hear a lot of people saying, oh, they're incompetent or whatever. It's like, they're not incompetent. They're creating an image of looking busy while being complicit in a genocide. They won't step over that line. They'll never stop aiding Israel. I really liked the commentary on democracy in this. There's a point where they have a vote. The chairman, he starts out as the spokesman for the management for the hotel, but then he assumes this kind of leadership role. He's like a strong man, he's able to kind of rile people's anger up and get them to unite in hate, basically. He's a fascist, and he gets everyone to vote in what is essentially apartheid for any of the strangers that have been initially let into the hotel, because some people turn up and they're like, oh yeah, we've got to help them. They're sick and they've been outside, and they help them, and then they let them dine with them. And then the chairman convinces everyone that like they're about to be overrun. So like this obvious allegory here for anti-immigration rhetoric. He proposes a vote for this segregation, and everyone votes it in, apart from the narrator and a couple of others. And then the family and the few people that have made it to the hotel from outside, suddenly they have their own not as good table at the other end of the dining room, and they're eating not as well. More of these injured people turn up, and they convert the library into a space for them to keep them away from the guests. Everything the management does is to shield the guests from seeing the reality of the crisis around them. And most of the guests are just consumed with living an illusion of life as it was before. They're just... And the narrator refers to them as holidaying guests a couple of times, and they are just on holiday. They're freaking out and they're going mad. They're not idiots, but they're having nice meals, and they celebrate the founding of the hotel with brandy one evening while there are dying people in the room next door. It's so dark. I kept thinking of Ice by Anneke Van while I was reading this. In the way it's written, this kind of weaving between realist and surrealist in this amazing dreamlike way that's incredibly compelling to read. And, like I was saying before, it's about how dull and mind-numbing and boring crisis is. It's so difficult to write about boredom without the writing being boring. I'm always really impressed when a writer manages to do that, like Sven Holm has here. There's a lot of Kafka in this. People often bring up Kafka with dystopian connotations, it's a warning of totalitarianism, which I think is just kind of getting mixed up with Orwell. Kafka wasn't warning about anything. He was writing about how it feels like to be oppressed as the little guy in society, in the society he lived in, which is essentially the same society we live in now. It's capitalism. And I think that's why I find Kafka so compelling, particularly over someone like Orwell. Kafka is always relevant because these problems haven't gone away and they're present. I think that's so much more powerful than talking about something which could happen in the future, but it's so extreme that it probably never will manifest like that. And particularly after the Second World War, fascism is never going to manifest in the exact same way it did then because it would be too obvious, but it still exists. Fascist-like thinking and structures are, they're growing all the time within Western society, and it's awful to watch it slowly happen, and you're like, what can I do about this? Which is what the main narrator is doing in this book. He's watching the guests become more and more cold and lose their compassion for helping the the people outside the hotel that haven't had the same privilege they've had inside the hotel over time as their privilege is threatened. And what makes this so good is that the only evidence of the threat to their comfort comes from the chairman and the management riling people up. Whenever they encounter people from outside, they're just happy to get medical care. The doctor's a really interesting character because he's almost like a bit of a confidant for the main narrator. They clearly have sympathies in that they both want to help the sick and the injured. The doctor is maybe a bit more caught up in the old structures that the management represent, or the structures of the old world, you know. At one point he says, the management is worried about litigation if they don't treat the guests a certain way or something like that. And the main character's like, in what court? You know, that's all gone. There's nothing anymore. Like, why are people still clinging to this stuff, you know? And that reminded me a bit of We Who Are About To. That's another book about being faced with an insurmountable crisis and most people, apart from the narrator, just deluding themselves. They even have a little court session in that book, and the main character, who is just Joanna Russ. Joanna Russ seems to be the main character in almost all of her fiction, which is a strong move. Barry Malzberg's like that as well. Yeah, she's just taking the piss. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you have no authority. You've dressed up like a judge or whatever, and you're sitting in a chair, but like, you're not actually a judge. I really like that sort of element of science fiction in particular, where you have characters in a situation, generally a crisis or whatever, or it's post-apocalyptic or something, and people just clinging to the ideology of their old lives in a completely delusional way. What I was going to say is something I find interesting about dystopian fiction is what makes a dystopia? Is it when everyone is unhappy? Or is it just when a lot of people are unhappy and there is still a privileged few? You know, lots of dystopias seem to have a privileged upper class at the top that are having a good time, and they generally focus on the underprivileged lower class, of which there are many. What if it's a minority that are having a bad time? Surely it's still a dystopia for them. Surely our world is a dystopia for them. I think that's not hard to accept looking at what's going on at the moment, particularly with like Palestine and Sudan, and also just the underpaid who have to struggle through every day, you know. It always kind of frustrates me when people talk about dystopia as like warning, and it's like, things are pretty bad for people now, you know? Maybe not for me or for everyone, but they are bad. And maybe we should focus on fixing that. But yeah, you know, what am I doing about it? I'm just talking about it to a camera, like nothing. And that's what the character in Termush is doing. He's just, all he's able to do is talk about his frustrations to the doctor and to Maria, who's the only named character in the book. They have an interesting relationship, which occurs almost entirely in the background. They start spending time together and then they're always together, but there's almost no reflection on their relationship because the crisis just overrules everything, you know, that takes up the foreground. And he's writing down in his diary. And there is a sense that he has more anger at the start when these policies first start getting implemented against the survivors, and the clear intention of management to obscure the truth of what's going on around the hotel to them. Like, they send out these reconnaissance men, they dress them up in like basically like spacesuits, you know, like radiation suits, and send them out to try and find some other location that has been saved from the war like they have. And they get reports over the radio of how they're bogged down helping people in this distressed town not far away, and then very quickly there are just no more reports from them at all, and you don't know what's happened. But I think what's happened is they've just started helping people, and then maybe something bad happened to them, but I don't think that's the implication. I think they were like, screw Termush, these people need our help, we'll stay here and help people. There's even a moment where the main character tries to give up his room to give more space to the sick and the injured who have been coming in from outside. And management are just like, no, you're not doing that. and he has an argument with them, and it's kind of awkward, and then that's it. Nothing happens. But you get the feeling that management don't want them to have a guest room, because then they might be seen like guests. It's just like apartheid. Or it works also as a very effective commentary for refugee status. I mean, the fact that, I think refugees were generally treated better in '69. This was written in Denmark. I don't know a lot about Denmark or the '60s, but people still have World War II in living memory, which is when a lot of the international laws protecting refugee rights were set up, right? Because everyone had just seen a horrible conflict, and they're like, yeah, we gotta treat each other with compassion. And then within a generation, everyone had forgotten. And because like in the UK, refugee status is protected under international law, which the UK at the moment still adheres to, even though all over the mainstream media and in Parliament, you regularly hear refugees being talked about as illegal. They're not illegal. It's everyone's legal right to seek asylum in another country when you're escaping some sort of conflict or humanitarian crisis. But despite that protection, they're not allowed to work. And they're given like almost no money to survive on. They can't do anything. They're stuck in limbo. Anyway, it's all mad. It's mad. But like, it reminded me of that. And I think it was brought up by the Greens in Parliament. They were like, you should let them work. And they're just like, they shoot it down immediately. It's like, because if you let them work, then they become like us. And we can't treat them like shit anymore, Yeah, Maria is interesting. We're first introduced to her as someone who's freaking out over being asked for a urine sample. The management are testing everyone's urine for radiation regularly. And she starts screaming and saying like, there's nothing wrong with my urine, there's nothing wrong with me. And the main character is just like, completely understandable behavior. Like, why isn't everyone acting like that? We're all acting like everything's normal. It's not normal. Everything's going horribly wrong. Like, she's one of the few people acting in a sane way. And then he starts hanging out with her and they start a relationship, which is very strange because, like I said, there's, just kind of going on in the background. There's almost no direct reflection on their relationship, just on the things they're doing together or the time they spend together. And they're both having like nightmares and telling each other about them and not helping each other by doing that. And like at one point, the main character kind of stumbles into a room and he thinks he sees her. I think he's sleepwalking. He thinks he sees her dead with radiation sickness, and there's a really horrible like description of her body. And he just tells her about it, and then afterwards, she's not the same. Like everyone's traumatizing each other. Like, and yeah, it's actually only the doctor in the end. He's been pretty consistent all the way through, and he's just like, you can all go off, whatever. Like, I'm staying. I'm going to help people. It's depicted with such nuance. This privileged group. It'd be so easy to make them into a caricature, but instead, they're human. But then over time, they're becoming more reactionary and scared and hateful. And there's some like quite terrifying scenes where they unite in their hate against someone who's broken one of the rules, and the details are scarce, but potentially they killed them. It's really bleak. The narrator talks about the hotel being an organism unto itself, whose reactions are unpredictable. But though within them there are human beings who like care about doing the right thing, but they're ultimately shed by the hotel, discarded. Yeah, the writing is full of these little, I think of them as like allegorical reversals. I don't know if that's actually a good name for them, but like the sort of thing Le Guin is really good at doing, drawing from her like Taoist inflected dualism. The narrator talks about leaving the hotel for the first time, going out in the gardens. He's watching everything being washed down and the soil being turned over by all the security men of management. But it's when he sees the sea, the ocean, that the weight of the realization of what has happened hits him. And the sea is the one thing that hasn't changed, but it's because of its indifference. It's indifferent now and it always was. And I think that is what shocks him and all the other guests. which I thought was a really nice bit of writing. And there's another part where he's like he's talking about being in the shelter. Going to the toilet is the only time you can forget about yourself because you're on your own. Because when you're constantly interacting with people, you're constantly so self-aware, you know, like just so many great little observations like that. He's talking to this guy as well who's been diagnosed by the doctor as having claustrophobia and insomnia. And the guy who's been diagnosed with these things, just like, it's not quite right. It's, you know, I feel like this restlessness. It's like a light shone within my body while I'm trying to sleep. And when he's describing the claustrophobia, it's far more kind of metaphysical. And then the doctor's just like, it's claustrophobia, it's insomnia, you know, like this complex ocean of subjective experience being boiled down to a single word in a diagnosis, you know. What I really like about Termush is it's a dystopia focusing on the privileged population. And I think it's so much more interesting because of that. Seeing like the meekness of the narrator, who like I see myself in, you know, like kind of looking at everything that's happening, being like, what the fuck is this? But you know, not really, but just kind of complaining about it. His biggest action is trying to give up his room, and they're just like, no. And he's like, oh, okay. And in the end, it doesn't really do anything. I think one of the quotes on the back is Kieran Millward Hargrave, who she wrote The Mercies. My wife read that and said it was good. Her quote is, "Building with the nauseating, relentless compulsion of a tidal wave, Termush touches on something elemental and true." I really like that image of the tidal wave. It felt a lot like that. It's just building and building and building, and there's nothing the guests can do to counteract it. Like, they can't stop people coming to the hotel. And like, what they should be doing is helping them. But instead they end up trying to fight them off, and everything goes to shit. But I loved how ambiguous, almost formless, the end is. Yeah, so that's Termush, Sven Holm. I haven't said much about Sven Holm himself. He was a Danish short story writer and playwright. He was part of a Danish literary modernist tradition called the Weird or the Fantastic, which sounds really interesting to me. I want to read more of his stuff. Like, this was so good. Yeah, read Termush. It's horrible. It's amazing. I think I'll end the review by quoting one of the more surreal scenes where he's describing the transition in state that the bomb has caused in the city. "We gaze at the dark mass where buildings, streets, trees, hordes of people, wide stretches of country with farms and herds of cattle are set solid like flies in amber. A hand has gripped a bottle of beer, and one can no longer tell the difference between the hand and the bottle. One face has turned to another, and the two faces are forever grafted together. Two outstretched arms are ready to hold a child that is running towards them, and the child is ready to run to the outstretched arms. A kitchen knife is stuck in the middle of the loaf, even though the person holding the knife had thought through to the end of the slice. Water streams out of the taps, and the cars are piled up in the streets, and nothing of this can be changed. The world has spun full circle. The survivors must exist without it. I understand our fear of getting involved in the disaster, and the days at Termush go by according to plan. The sun continues to shine, meals are served, and music flows out of the loudspeaker. The more we conform to type, and the mirrors in our rooms show that we do not conform to type, the more the world will be true to itself. Therefore, it is madness to talk about change. We are the living proof of this antithesis." So the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that there's still plenty of time to go on the video. There's a few more things I want to talk about, which I'll get to in a bit. First, I want to have a little chat about Jeff Vandermeer's introduction to Termush, or his foreword, sorry. There are some good things in it, but I also have a few bones to pick. In his foreword, Vandermeer focuses more on the aesthetic, the metaphysical, and the psychological implications of the novella, and he does a fairly good job of that. Although he does occasionally seem to be using overly esoteric language. It's like he was trying to make it needlessly dense in places. It's a bit strange. But anyway, it's fine. So he mentions a couple of things that I brushed over quite quickly, the most important of which is the Cold War inspiration for the book. Vandermeer talks about the fear of the bomb and the fear of other world-ending scenarios, including the pandemic, which a lot of people who are reading this book point to as indicative of its prescience or whatever, This is interesting because, obviously in the 60s and 70s, the Cold War has a huge influence on science fiction, speculative fiction. Tom Dish talks about this really well in The Dreams Our Stuff Is Made Of. That book is a bit all over the place, in my opinion. Some of the essays are better than others, but his chapter on the fear of the bomb is incredible. It's worth getting that book just to read that chapter, where he talks about how the fear of the bomb was made palatable by satire like Dr. Strangelove, and then he talks a lot about Philip K. Dick's role in this, including his book Dr. Blood Money. It's a really good essay. It's worth checking out. And he talks about how this mollification of this world-ending fear has continued in speculative fiction and science fiction. We got zombie movies and all kinds of post-apocalyptic scenarios depicted in fiction and disaster flicks and that sort of thing. Vandermeer says, each fear led to the other. I think that's a bit of a weird wording. Let's find it here. He says, our fear of radiation and immolation has led to climate crisis fear, which has led to pandemic fear. Led to is a weird wording, right? It implies that they're causing each other. I think the fear in itself, this fear of the end of the world, can be generalized to a certain extent. But these are all legitimate fears. We could destroy the world this way, or the world could end this way, civilization could collapse this way, or whatever. Which reminds me of, did anyone go on that website, Exit Mundi? Years ago, it's when I was a kid, that depicted all of the different world-ending scenarios. I wonder if that's still around. Oh, Reddit nostalgia. Anyone remember the Exit Mundi website? Okay, I'm not alone in this. exitmundi.nl. So it's a Dutch website. It's got a Wikipedia page. It looks like it's gone down. Oh no, it's archived. Hell yes. I am going to be looking at this later. So yeah, it's fun to imagine the end of the world in a kind of macabre way. Yeah, Vandermeer talks about how he says, the grappling of minds with these threats leads to derangement and odd visions because the elements of infiltration and contamination baffle the brain. Our hauntings in the modern era are so often now not ghosts, but simply the things we cannot see, but that radically affect us. So he's talking about hyper objects, that whole thing, we all know what climate change is, but it's impossible to define precisely because it's just too complex and unpredictable and that sort of thing. I really liked that idea when I first came across it, but I don't know, increasingly I just feel like everything's like that, Everything is way more complicated than you could possibly imagine. There's always more to it than you're thinking or able to think. Not to say you can't think more about something, think deeply about it and construct more categories around it and that sort of thing. But that's just the way thinking works, right? But anyway, it is quite a useful concept to just kind of pull out the bag, I guess. And he starts talking about the hyperreal or the ultra-real. That's a new one for me. And the deficiencies of emergency management and stuff like that. He makes a really good point that the right excerpt from Termush could have easily appeared in New Worlds. I completely agree. This is fully in line with the new wave science fiction going on in Britain around the same time. But there's a couple of things that I found a bit strange. One is Vandermeer doesn't mention politics at all. And for me, this was a very political book. And I was surprised, having read this, to not see that mentioned in the foreword. It's strange. It feels like it's almost the point of the book for me. He mentions the social critique and he says it's basic. He says, few dystopian novels focused on a privileged group's reaction to disaster lack some social critique. And if Termush's commentary seems basic, well, perhaps the modern monoculture needs to become more complex. As ever, from before Termush, during Termush, and after Termush, rich people tend to be more able to escape the effects of an event for the obvious reasons. Completely agree with that bit. I think a lot of the takes on this book seem to revolve around how the rich are more shielded from disaster, but that wasn't how I really read the book at all. I thought it was a much more interesting allegory for the middle class, or the citizen, as opposed to the refugee, and the privilege your average citizen has over the people without, that want to come through the borders. And the desire of the narrator for things to be different, but who in the end is ineffectual and doesn't actually produce any change. That hit me hard, and I saw myself in that. I'm kind of amazed Vandermeer doesn't mention it, but yeah, people have different takes from stories, and that's fine. People get different things out of it. But I just thought that was interesting. To say the social critique is basic, I think that's not okay. I completely disagree. I thought it was quite nuanced and ambiguous, and it kept me guessing. And I still haven't made my mind up about the narrator and what happens, especially considering the end, which is interesting. Yeah, I don't know. That caught my eye. So yeah, I think Vandermeer was interpreting the social critique as purely I don't know, like those tech bros who were buying up land in New Zealand for after the apocalypse, which is fair enough, and it works as a critique of that. But I think it also works really well as a critique of the average citizen. Which reminds me, I forgot in my review to mention my favourite exchange in the book, which is when the narrator's talking to the doctor after the vote has been cast to segregate the injured people turning up to the hotel. And the doctor says something like, well, it's democracy or whatever. And the narrator says something to the effect of, well, in my mind, democracy would involve the people outside the hotel as well as the ones inside. Very cool. Extremely cool. Extremely political. Jeff, you got nothing to say about that? You got nothing to say about that? The other thing I noticed was that Vandermeer says this about Sven Holm. A highly honoured literary realist in Denmark, Holm may not have expected or even intended to create a speculative novella that reads so well to a modern audience. His other works contain no such element, but many do feature similar grand gestures, and all critique modern society, seeking ways to, for a lack of a better term, wake the reader up to the evils of capitalism and other consumptive ideologies. So yeah, fair enough, most of his work is anti-capitalist, but the thing that's coming across here is that Sven Holm is a literary realist who didn't do much speculative fiction. And so it's a surprise that we've got Termush, from this guy. Yeah, that's an interesting take. Remember that as we move on to what I really want to talk about. So I was looking up Sven Holm, and it's not easy to do when limiting yourself to the Anglophone part of the internet. If you look at what the Danes are saying, where he's really at is in his short stories. And I like short stories. I like talking about short stories. So I thought, I want to read some of those short stories. That would be cool. But none of his collections are translated. 2 of them, at least, were award-winning in Denmark. But yeah, they've never been translated into English in their entirety. So that's disappointing. And the same goes for his plays. I can't find any English translations. I would love to be wrong about this. If anyone knows of any English translations of these short story collections or Sven Holm's plays, please tell me about them. I'm putting out a call for this. I want to read more of this guy. But I did some digging around online, and I found that there is an anthology of Danish fiction from the 60s, or covering the 60s. It was published in 1971, edited by Sven Holm, which includes a story by him that was meant to show what was going on in Danish literature to the Anglophone world. So it was translated to English, obviously, which is called The Devil's Instrument and Other Stories. And yeah, I tried to track down a copy of that, and there are a few secondhand copies going in America, but the postage is ridiculous. I would end up having to spend over 50 quid or something to read one short story. I mean, I'd read the others, but I couldn't really justify that purchase. But I had a scrounge around in some other areas of the internet, and I found a digital copy. So I read the introduction, which is weirdly not written by Sven Holm, who edited the anthology, but Dr. Elias Bredsdorff, who is a Danish author and academic. He talks about the various things going on in Danish literature at the time. He talks about how a lot of the writers in the 60s in Denmark have come out of the literary realism that had been popular in previous decades, but are more interested in taking the techniques from that and melding it with the fantastic stuff from fairy tales, just the strange. A lot of it sounds like literary weird fiction, you know? And I read the title story, which is The Devil's Instrument by Frank Jaeger, which is about this young guy. He talks about having to sell all his books to buy a suit to impress a girl, but it doesn't impress her, and then he ends up losing his only other prized possession, his double bass, because of a girl, but really it was because the devil tricked him. In the introduction, Bredsdorff talks about it as if it's a modern fairy tale, but I thought it was more ambiguous than that. The whole thing could easily be chalked up to the main character's delusion, and I think that's more interesting, actually. But it definitely has that fairy tale feel to it. And, you know, like Denmark obviously has a rich fairy tale tradition with like Hans Christian Andersen and stuff like that. Elias Bredsdorff actually wrote a famous biography of him. So, yeah, there's that whole thing going on. So it's difficult to tell where Bredsdorff's interests and Sven Holm's interests overlap, because one person did the editing and the other person wrote the introduction. But considering the choice of stories, a lot of them involve elements of the fantastic, the weird. It doesn't sound like purely literary realism. Bredsdorff's comment on Sven Holm's story in this, which is Miss Urst visits the deer park, is interesting. He says, Sven Holm's short story, beginning on a note of almost pedestrian realism, but gradually moving on until it becomes an uncanny study in psychological abnormality, is really concerned with erotic fetishism and other Freudian revelations of the unconscious workings of the human mind. Sounds cool, right? And it is. It's amazing. So I read that story. It's so good. I saw a review of Sven Holm's 2000s short story collection online that mentioned Miss Urst in the Deer Park as a schoolroom classic. So I assume, at least in the 2000s, but probably still now, everyone's like studying this story in school. So if any Danes are watching this, I'm really sorry if everything I'm saying is really obvious or I'm making some blatant mistakes or anything. But I'm just really interested in this guy, and he's clearly so good, but we have almost none of his writing in the English language, apart from Termush. It's great, but it doesn't sound like it's even his best work. So yeah, Miss Urst Visits the Deer Park is absolutely mad. If Tom Dish had been aware of that story, he would have put it in Strangeness, for sure. It's about this woman who, you get the impression she's beautiful, but very like prim and proper. She wears a fur coat, and she's got 2 poodles with her, and she does the equivalent of holding her nose before she goes on the train, right? She like takes a desperate inhale of her own cologne before stepping onto this train. It reminded me a bit of The Wardrobe by Thomas Mann as well. Like a train is a great place to start a short story. You know, it's very convenient. No one is overly curious about where they've been before, because it's almost like a separation between before and after, right? A clean break. You're on the platform, you get on the train, right, we're going. Like, the story starts. There's a guy who starts staring at her, and she gets into like a staring contest with him. She's like, he's not gonna like scare me off, like he'll break first. And she just keeps staring at him, and he just keeps staring back. Yeah, you definitely get the feeling that there's some like erotic implication, but it's not clear, you know. Eventually he gets off the train, and she keeps staring at her reflection in the glass. She keeps greeting her reflection. It's like nodding and saying, yeah, Miss Urst, like, Like she has to remind herself who she is all the time. Before the train leaves, he's on the other side of the glass, like smiling at her. It's creepy as hell, and it rattles her. She keeps looking at her reflection and looking out at the landscape beyond, but not really considering the landscape. She instead, you get these elaborate descriptions of her imagination. Like she's picturing these cold white marble columns reaching up to the sky, and then the sun is turned to ice. And then a little afterwards, she looks at the moon and she's consumed by this vision of like a Buddha statue getting consumed by the jungle as it grows over it. And the description of the smells and the moisture in the air and everything is really intense. I thought that was interesting as well, because in Termush, the writing is often quite detached. You're not always getting these detailed descriptions. Like you're not necessarily pulled into the present moment, you know, because it's epistolary and it's intentional as well. I think it's to create this sense of alienation with what's going on, this disconnect from reality. But here you haven't got that. It's a lot more intense and vibrant. And yeah, you know, we're in symbolism territory here. We got like cold marble pillars with a frozen sun and like jungle moon. I mean, it doesn't perfectly map onto like the Apollonian and the Dionysian, but like I'm getting this feeling, you know, like the cold calculation of civilization in stone, lifeless, and then the wilderness opposed to that, the animalistic component. It's about the internal conflict between those two things, right? Which is in all of us. But he's chosen this very prim and proper, very clearly materialistic person to embody this conflict, which is interesting. I'm going to burn the story down. I'm burning it down. It will be as interesting to read with it spoiled or whatever, like, and this is the only way I can think to talk about it. So she carries on with the train journey. She has some weird interactions with her dogs. She grasps a knife in her bag. She's like clearly anxious about something. And yeah, and then it gets weird. It gets really weird. And she gets off the train and like goes into this park and slowly but surely just gets consumed by this like ritualistic passion. She ends up stripping off all her clothes and like touching her body. You're getting a real feel for the unleashed sexual repression, you know, that sort of thing. She's like scratching herself on the hawthorn bush and literally howling at the moon. She's going for it. And she tries to turn herself into a bird. Despite her incantations, she can't seem to manifest as this terrifying bird that would be able to rip apart any beast, but also be gentle and be able to fly to the cold frozen sun of the gleaming white pillars, you know. It's bizarre. It's amazing. And then she does something really horrible. She sacrifices her poodles using the knife that was in her bag. And the description of that is incredibly graphic. It's deeply unsettling. So yeah, I guess be aware of that if you are interested in reading it. I don't know if that's necessary to warn people of that. You know, there's lots of violence in everything, but if that's not your thing, that's not your thing, that's fine. Despite not turning into a bird, a lot of the descriptions of her movements following that are like she folded her wings around. She's thinking of her arms as wings, which is cool. I absolutely loved this story. I thought it was amazing. I thought it was so good. And it was better than a lot of the stories in Strangeness. It belonged in that anthology. Like, it should have been in there. Obviously, there's a huge amount of this stuff, you know, this kind of, well, I mean, it's just weird fiction, isn't it? But I'm really interested in this particular brand of authors applying these very literary techniques, or literary realist techniques as well, to weird fiction, and taking it to absurd, surreal places to investigate interiority or to interrogate politics. It's great. It's so cool. And Sven Holm, I think all of his short stories are doing that. And this isn't necessarily his best story. This is going to turn into just me begging the internet to somehow translate his short story collections and his plays. I want to read those plays. I did find another short story of Sven Holm's that has been translated into English, but I couldn't find a digital copy of it, and the physical copies are just way too expensive for me to buy. But it's in a journal called 2 Lines, put out by the Centre for the Art of Translation. It seems like they regularly translate short fiction from around the world into English and publish it in this journal, 2 Lines. I think that's a really cool thing to be doing. But yeah, this one, 2 Lines 7, Crossings, came out in the 2000s, I think. Yeah, again, there's some copies going in America. The postage is too much for me, but I don't know. It might not be worth it for just one story, but just to make people aware. And make people aware of that journal. It seems cool. One of the big things with AI is they were like, it's going to usher in a whole new age of like translation. Everyone's going to have access to everything. And like, yeah, it's not good at translating fiction. Translation is so culturally specific as well. It's not just a linguistic thing. In many ways, the translator is a co-author of the book, of the translated book, you know? People put a lot of weight on the accuracy of a translation, which I don't care too much about. I don't necessarily want the translation to be accurate. I want it to make me feel the same things it made people reading it in the original language feel. I want the same experience. I don't want the same text or the exact same things happening. I've come across a few things now where I'm like, oh, do I get the old translation or the new translation? And of course, there's a lot of marketing going on, pushing new translations, and they're like, hey, this is better. And, you know, maybe it is in certain respects or whatever. But I've encountered a couple of modern translations that weren't as good. And they were really pushing the whole, it's more accurate thing. And it's like, well, but it doesn't read as, it's not as fun to read. There's a different mentality about it because it's the same medium, even though it's 2 different languages. Whereas when you're adapting a book to TV or film or whatever, people seem to regularly accept that, yeah, it's got to be changed to fit the different medium. Or why is that not true for a different language as well? You know, to a certain extent. But anyway, yeah, translators, really cool. Which reminds me, Sylvia Clayton translated Termush. Is this a new translation? I don't think so. I think it was 69. Yeah, Sylvia Clayton's translation in 1969. I think it's really good. And I'm really grateful for that translation. Who translated The Devil's Instrument and Other Stories? Translated by Paula Hostrup Jessen. As always, I apologize for all my pronunciations. It's so weird to me that Sven Holm edited the collection and then another author did the introduction. I guess it was like a big kind of team effort. It looks like it was funded by like UNESCO and some Danish Arts Council and stuff like that. More of that stuff, please. It's a great idea. So the short story in 2 Lines 7, The Crossings, is called The Poet, translated by Lifa Jensen. Don't even know what it's about. Yeah, Sven Holm seems like a really cool guy. Wikipedia has like nothing about him. I ended up on an Encyclopedia Britannica, and I thought this was cool, talking about his first short story collection, his like breakout book. In the title story of his first collection, Den Store Fiende, The Great Enemy, Holm described how a village church on the precipice is gradually crumbling and falling into the sea. The village is a metaphor for a society that has become warped by politics and in which the urge to prosper has become man's central fulfillment. In their private life, the realization dawns upon the main character during a marriage crisis that material things have usurped the central meaning in his life. In most of Holm's novels, he dealt with different forms of social exploitation, poverty in Sigurd Munter. Why am I even trying with the Danish? I'm really sorry if anyone's Danish listening to this. Sick and Happy, 1972. Corruption of language in Jomfrute, Maiden Voyage, and Ignorance in Termush. Interesting. Ignorance. In his intense prose poem on the theme of human suffering, 7 Passions, Holm offered a utopian alternative to the psychological breakdown and envisioned collapse of the Western way of life. Again, does that sound like the kind of guy who's writing speculative fiction? Because it sure does to me. I feel like Jeff Vandermeer was chatting out of his ass. I feel like they should have gotten someone Danish to write the introduction. Like, he's well known in Denmark and they know the history and the literature. Yeah, the foreword felt like it just felt like the wrong person for the job. I like Jeff Vandermeer as well. I feel like I need to say that. Like, I've enjoyed Annihilation and what's the one after that? Authority. That's a really good workplace horror book, actually. That's all I've read by him so far. I'm really bad at reading sequels. I need to finish that trilogy, like the Southern Reach trilogy. He sounds like he's written other really cool books as well, but bit of a swing and a miss. Not the best forward in the world. No one's perfect. This isn't a character assassination. Part of the so-called fantastic or strange prose modernism that with Karen Blixen and Ville Sorensen was strongly asserted in Danish poetry of the 1950s and 60s. He's part of a loose movement referred to as fantastic or strange, weird. Again, not strictly realist, coming from realism into that, but so interesting. I think it sounds like there's really cool, like literary weird fiction going on in the 60s in Denmark and possibly beyond. I mean, like, I know nothing about Danish literature, but this all seems completely fascinating. Yeah, in his script-themed utopia, The Beloved, a template novel, 1968, sounds really interesting as well. Two agents, A and B, aim to conquer Copenhagen and incite the Copenhageners to revolt. However, their revolution loses direction and is reduced to violence. The story about them is a cartoon-like frame for the depictions of Copenhagen, which all portray society as a rigid mechanical entity. Per Hyolt writes in his review of the novel, reality for Holm is not a rigid entity, but something that is constantly being created and recreated. I feel like I'm torturing myself now because I'm like reading about how great all this stuff is, and I know there's no translation. I can only read about it, and even then it's quite hard to find. I got like scattered reviews across that most mysterious area of the internet, the Dane web, and they're all just chatting like everyone already knows this stuff anyway, so it's like, I don't know, more Sven Holm, please. That would be great. Anyway, Termush is great. Miss Urst visits the deer park. Phenomenal short story. Yeah, cool. I'm really glad I picked this up. You should too. So yeah, I guess I'm just ending with a plea to the Danish, because I know you all speak English. Please, translate some Sven Holm for us, and whoever else you think we need to be reading, because I know you got some good shit. Yeah, hope you're all good and enjoying autumn, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere anyway. I'm getting cozy, got my sweater on. I'm loving it. This is my favourite season, by far. It's excellent. Great temperature. Just great vibes. I can't even put my finger on it. I just like it. It's just great. Followed by the worst season. And that's the only thing that sucks about autumn. Anyway, yeah. Catch you later.